December 1893, Harlow Creek Valley, Montana Territory. The temperature had not climbed above zero in 11 days. At that kind of cold, the world stops being soft. Snow does not drift. It blows sideways and cuts like glass. The Missouri River tributaries freeze so solid that wolves walk across them at night without slowing down. Trees crack in the darkness, sharp, explosive sounds like rifle shots, as the frozen wood splits from the inside out. By the second week of December, nearly every family in Harlow Creek Valley was doing the same mental calculation. They were counting logs, counting days, counting whether the two numbers would meet somewhere before March. Most of them already knew the answer, and the answer frightened them. Amos Buxton stood outside his barn one morning and stared at his woodpile for a long time without moving. His breath came out in short white clouds. He had 3 children inside. His wife, Margaret, was already rationing heat, letting the stove burn low during the middle of the day to save wood for the night. He counted his remaining cords. Then he counted again. The math did not improve the second time. Across the valley, other families moved through the same quiet dread. Water buckets froze solid before morning. Livestock stood pressed together in barns, sharing what warmth their bodies could generate. Men who had lived in Montana for 15 years said they had never felt cold like this. Not like this, not this early, not this deep. The wind was the thing that made it different from ordinary cold. An ordinary Montana winter was cold the way a stone is cold. You could press against it, endure it, manage it if you were careful. But this December came with wind that moved constantly, that never rested, that found every gap in every structure in the valley and worked at it with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be and nothing else to do. That kind of cold could not simply be endured. It had to be fought every hour with fire and wood and the particular vigilance of people who understood that the difference between a bad night and a catastrophic one was a stove that went cold at 3 in the morning. And yet, on the eastern edge of the valley, sitting alone against a low ridge, there was one cabin that seemed untouched by the crisis. No frantic trips to a dwindling woodpile. No smoke pouring desperately from the chimney. No sense of a household burning everything it had just to stay alive for one more night. The chimney smoked lightly, steadily, but lightly, the way a chimney smokes when the fire inside has all the time in the world. From a distance, the cabin looked strange. It did not look like a cabin anymore. It looked like something a child might build if you handed that child an enormous pile of logs and told him to be creative. Walls of stacked timber rose 8 feet high on every side, surrounding the small house completely. The actual structure was barely visible inside, just the top of the roof and the chimney rising above the wooden walls like a flag planted on conquered ground. Most people in Harlow Creek Valley knew exactly whose cabin that was, and most of them had spent the past 5 months laughing about it. Her name was Ingrid Sorensen. She was 52 years old. She was a widow. She had come to Montana from Norway in 1878 with her husband Reuben, and she had stayed when the land proved harder than anyone had promised. And she had stayed again when Reuben died in the autumn of 1891 and left her with a homestead, 2 children, and a Montana winter that did not care about any of it. The laughter had started in July. That was when people first noticed what she was building. But to understand why Ingrid Sorensen built a wall of firewood around her house, you have to go back further than July of 1893. You have to go back to a night in February of 1892 when the temperature dropped to 30 below and Ingrid sat alone on the floor of her cabin with her back against the stove and her son Caleb burning with fever on the bed behind her. Reuben had been dead for 5 months by then. He had died the way men died on the frontier. Not slowly, not with warning, not with time to prepare. He had been riding back from a neighbor's property when his horse stumbled, crossing an icy creek. The fall was bad. The cold made it worse. By the time word reached Ingrid and she got to him, there was nothing to do but hold his hand and wait for the end to come in its own time. She was 49 years old, her son was 11, her daughter Ruth was 7. The grief she carried that winter was not the dramatic kind that breaks things and makes noise. It was quieter than that. It was the grief of a woman who had to be awake every 2 hours to feed the stove, who had to chop her own wood in temperatures that made the axe handle sting through her gloves, who had to do every single thing that needed doing because if she didn't, nothing would get done at all. There was no one to share the load with. There was no one to spell her at the stove while she slept. There was no one to look at across the table at the end of a hard day and simply say, "We made it through another one." She did it. She kept going. That was what she knew how to do. It was perhaps the most important thing she knew how to do, and she had known it since childhood. The ability to put one foot in front of the other when every reasonable instinct said to sit down and rest. But that February night, with Caleb burning beside her and the cold pressing against every wall of the cabin like something alive and patient and inexhaustible, she made a mistake. She panicked. Not visibly, not loudly. Ingrid Sorensen was not a woman who panicked in ways that other people could see. But inside, in the place where decisions are actually made, something broke through the wall of discipline she had maintained since October, and she stopped calculating and started reacting. She burned too much wood too fast, trying to drive the coal back, trying to hold the temperature steady, trying to keep her son from getting worse. She fed the stove through the night at a pace she couldn't afford, and by morning the fever had broken, and Caleb was breathing steadily, and the color was returning slowly to his face, and the woodpile outside was nearly gone. She stood at the cabin door in the gray winter light and looked at what remained. Not enough. Not nearly enough to finish the season. The stacks she had built in October with such care and such confidence were reduced to something that would last, at best, another 3 weeks. And there were still 6 weeks of serious cold ahead. In that moment, with the cold air moving against her face and the sky showing nothing but more gray and more cold, Ingrid felt something she had not let herself feel since the day Reuben died. She felt afraid, not for herself. That fear she could manage. She had managed it for 5 months, and she would manage it until it became something she simply carried rather than something that stopped her. But for Caleb, for Ruth, for the two of them sitting inside that cabin, depending on her to figure this out, depending on her to be the person who had already thought of everything, who had already solved the problem before it became a crisis, who would never, not ever, stand at the door of a cold cabin with a nearly empty woodpile and no good answer. She stood there for a long time, and then from somewhere in the deep back of her memory, she heard her father's voice. Ingrid had grown up in the logging settlements of western Norway, in the valley country where the winters came hard off the mountains, and the timber industry built its camps and its sorter yards along the frozen riverbanks. Her father, Gunnar, had worked those yards for 30 years, a quiet man, observant in the way that men who work outdoors in extreme conditions tend to become observant over time. He noticed things. He paid attention to the world around him the way a sailor pays attention to the sky, not because he was looking for anything in particular, but because the habit of attention was how he stayed alive and kept his family alive and made sense of a world that did not always cooperate with what people needed from it. When Ingrid was 9 or 10 years old, she had asked him once why the families who lived closest to the timber stacks always seemed warmer in winter. She had noticed it herself. The way the cabins pressed up against the great walls of sorted logs seemed to breathe easier in January. The way smoke from their chimneys moved lazily instead of frantically. The way the children who lived in those cabins came to school without the pinched, exhausted look that the children in the more exposed houses sometimes wore by February. Her father had looked at her for a moment before answering. He was not a man who gave long explanations. He said what he needed to say and trusted you to think about it and arrive at the right conclusions on your own. He believed that understanding you had worked for yourself was more durable than understanding that had been handed to you. Wood holds the sun, he told her. Sit in the light all day and it drinks the warmth in. Come nighttime, it lets it go slowly. And it stops the wind. Cold travels on wind. Stop the wind, and you stop half the winter. She had been 9 years old. She had nodded and filed the information somewhere useful and moved on to the next thing, the way children do with pieces of knowledge they are not yet old enough to need. But standing at the door of her Montana cabin in February of 1892, with her woodpile nearly gone and her son recovering from fever on a cold bed and 6 weeks of winter still ahead of her, that memory came back with the kind of clarity that only extreme cold and genuine fear can produce. It came back complete and fully formed, the way certain memories do when the circumstances that produce them are precisely replicated. She looked at the woodpile. She looked at the cabin walls. She started thinking. The thinking took the rest of that winter and all of spring and most of the summer of 1892. She did not rush it. Ingrid Sorensen had not survived the death of her husband and 2 Montana winters alone by making hasty decisions. She thought carefully the way her father had taught her to think, observing first, concluding later, trusting the evidence of her own eyes over what other people told her was sensible or possible or worth attempting. What she kept coming back to was simple. The cabin was losing the battle against the cold because the wind reached its walls directly. Every gust that crossed the open valley floor struck the logs and pulled the heat from the other side. The stove worked constantly, and most of what it produced disappeared almost immediately, carried away by the wind before the cabin had a chance to hold it. It was not a problem of fuel. It was a problem of exposure. She was not running out of warmth. She was losing it faster than she could make it. But the timber stacks in her father's yards had changed that equation. They had created a break, a physical barrier between the wind and the structure it was trying to cool. And more than that, the wood itself had held warmth. Thousands of logs stacked together, absorbing what little heat the pale winter sun produced during the short daylight hours, releasing it slowly and steadily through the long nights. The stacks were not merely barriers. They were thermal storage. They were a buffer between the inside world and the outside one. What would happen, she thought, if the cabin were surrounded entirely by stacked wood? Not just one wall, not just the north side, which took the worst of the prevailing wind. All four walls, a full 8 feet of solid timber on every side from the ground to the roof line. What would happen to the wind then? What would it find when it reached the outer edge of that wall? And what would happen to the air trap in between the outer wood wall and the cabin itself? That narrow corridor of stillness, protected on all sides from the moving air that stole heat with such ruthless efficiency? She thought she knew the answer. She had spent 42 years observing winters, first in Norway and then in Montana. She was not guessing, she was calculating. There was a difference between those two things, and she had always known the difference, and she trusted it now. The plan took shape slowly, the way all serious plans do when the person making them intends to actually carry them out and cannot afford to get it wrong. She would need to collect far more wood than she normally cut in a season. The stacks surrounding the cabin would require an enormous amount of timber, more than most families burned in 3 full winters. She would need to build a proper wooden frame to keep the outer walls stable and plumb through the shifts and settling of a hard winter. She would need to design a covered entrance, a tunnel through the wood, essentially, that would allow her to reach the cabin door without breaking the protection the walls provided. The entrance was not a detail. The entrance was one of the most important parts of the design. A gap in the wall was a place for wind to enter, and a place for wind to enter was a place for warmth to leave. The tunnel had to be long enough and covered well enough to prevent that. And she would need to do all of this before October, when the snow arrived and the ground froze too hard for the postwork that would anchor the frame. She began cutting extra timber in the spring of 1892. She stacked it behind the barn, where it would season through the summer and autumn. She said nothing to anyone about what she was planning, partly because she was still working it out in her own mind, and partly because she already knew, with complete certainty, what people would say if she told them. She had lived in Harlow Creek Valley long enough to know how people talked about unusual ideas, and she had no interest in spending a year defending her thinking before she had proved it correct. The time for explaining would come later. The time for building was now. By the summer of 1893, she was ready. The frame went up first. Posts sunk 3 feet into the earth, 8 feet out from the cabin walls on every side, horizontal beams connecting them into a rectangular skeleton that surrounded the house completely, a second structure growing around the first one like a wooden shadow. Anyone riding past the Sorensen homestead during those weeks in July saw something they could not immediately explain, a frame standing in the summer heat with no obvious purpose, too large to be a simple addition to the property and too precisely positioned relative to the cabin to be anything accidental. Amos Buxton came by on a Wednesday morning in the last week of July. Amos had ranched in Harlow Creek Valley for 11 years. He was a practical man in the particular way that frontier ranchers tend to become practical. He believed in what worked and had developed over the years a reliable instinct for what didn't, an instinct sharpened by watching other settlers make the full range of mistakes that the frontier offered. He had seen men plant crops in soil that would not support them. He had seen structures built without adequate foundation buckle and collapse under the first serious snow load. He had seen people underestimate Montana winter in ways that cost them livestock, property, and occasionally more than that. He was, at his core, a man who trusted experience over theory and results over intentions. It was not a bad way to be. In most circumstances, it served him well. He dismounted at the fence and looked at the frame for a long moment without speaking. Ingrid was working near the south wall, her sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the summer heat, moving with the efficient economy of someone who has done physical labor all her life and has made a permanent peace with it. She was 52 years old, but she moved like a woman who had not made peace with the idea of slowing down and did not intend to. Amos leaned on the fence post. "What are you building, Mrs. Sorensen?" "A woodshed," she said without stopping what she was doing. He looked at the frame again, the full perimeter of it, the distance from the cabin wall. He looked at the scale of it. "Around the whole house?" "Yes." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You mean to fill all of this with firewood?" "Yes." Amos was quiet for a moment. He looked at the distance between the outer frame and the cabin wall. 8 feet, maybe a little more in places. He did the rough calculation in his head, the cubic footage, the number of cords that would be required to fill a structure of that size to the depth she was describing. And the number that came back was very large. "That's going to take an enormous amount of wood," he said. "Yes," Ingrid said. "That's enough fuel for 3 winters." "I know." He studied the structure again. He looked at her. He looked back at the structure. His expression moved through several stages: confusion, then the particular kind of skepticism that comes not from dismissal, but from trying and failing to understand the logic behind something, and then something that was working toward understanding, but could not quite get there. "Mrs. Sorensen," he said finally, "first spark off that chimney, this whole setup burns like a matchbox." He paused. "You'd lose the house and everything in it before you could get the children out." Ingrid stopped what she was doing. She set down the tool in her hand and looked at him directly for the first time since he had arrived. "There is 4 feet of open space around the chimney on every side," she said. Her voice was patient but not soft. "Stone on the ground underneath it. Flat Creek stones, laid last week. The wood does not come within 4 feet of any part of the flue, not at the base, not at the top." Amos opened his mouth, then he closed it. He had come with a specific objection. The most obvious objection, the objection that any practical person would raise immediately about a structure of this kind, and she had already accounted for it. Not just thought about it, accounted for it, built a solution into the design before he had even arrived to point out the problem. She went back to work. He stood at the fence for another minute or two, looking at the frame, looking at her, looking at the cabin hidden inside the skeleton of posts and beams. Then he remounted his horse without saying anything else and rode down the road toward Cutler Creek. He did not laugh at her, not then, not directly to her face. Whatever else Amos Buxton was, he was not the kind of man who laughed at a woman to her face about something she had clearly spent considerable time thinking about. But by the time he reached the general store in the valley town of Cutler Creek that afternoon, the story had found its audience, and the audience was not as restrained as he had been. The laughter was not cruel exactly. It was the laughter of people who believed they were being sensible. The ranchers at the store counter, who had survived a decade of Montana winters and felt that their survival constituted expertise. The farm wives who had spent those same winters managing every practical emergency the frontier offered and trusted their own hard-won judgment about what worked. The older men who sat near the back of the store and had seen enough newcomer mistakes to have developed very firm opinions about what was possible and what was foolish. They had seen stubborn settlers before. They had seen widows in particular, women alone without men to check their thinking, dig in and refuse reasonable advice in ways that made their situations worse rather than better. They knew what winter did to people who miscalculated, and they knew that the worst miscalculations were always the ones the person making them was most certain about. "She's going to burn through a fortune in timber," someone said. "She already has been," said another. "I've seen the stacks she's been cutting since last spring. It's half the ridge behind her property. What does she think it's going to do?" "Something about insulation," said a third. "Wind protection." The room processed this. There was a pause. Then the laughter, not a single burst of it, but a sustained, rolling thing, fed by one comment after another. One man called it the biggest bonfire in Montana history waiting to happen. Another said the widow had apparently left her judgment behind in Norway, along with everything else she should have stayed with. A third said at least when it burned down she would have enough coals to stay warm through February, which got the biggest laugh of all. Only one man in the store did not laugh. Ezra Whitmore sat in a chair near the window, the way he always did, watching more than talking. He was 70 years old, Danish-born, and had been in the American West since before most of the men in that room were born. He had crossed the continent in 1849 and had been watching people make decisions about how to live in hard country ever since. He had seen things work that looked foolish from the outside, and he had seen things fail that looked perfectly sensible, and the experience had left him with a deep suspicion of the kind of certainty that came easily and loudly. He watched the men laugh. He said nothing. But on his ride home that evening, he took the longer route, the one that passed the Sorensen homestead on the eastern edge of the valley. And he slowed his horse as he went by and looked at the frame taking shape around the cabin and looked at the woman still working in the long summer light and sat with what he saw for a while before moving on. He didn't say anything to anyone about what he thought. Not yet. That was not his way. Ezra Whitmore had learned a long time ago that premature opinions were a form of waste. They committed you to positions before the evidence was complete, and evidence had a way of becoming more complicated before it became clear. He would wait and see. He had always been good at waiting. The hardest conversation happened on a Tuesday evening in early August, and it came from a direction Ingrid had not fully prepared herself for. Caleb Sorensen was 12 years old that summer, old enough to understand exactly what the other boys at school were saying about his family, and old enough to feel the particular and specific embarrassment of having mockery directed not at himself but at his mother, which was somehow worse. You could defend yourself. You could fight back or ignore it or decide it didn't matter. But you could not fight back on someone else's behalf without it looking like something different than it was. And at 12 years old, in a schoolyard, looking like anything other than what you intended was its own kind of disaster. He came in from evening chores and sat down at the table without saying anything. He ate in silence. Ingrid watched him and waited. She knew that silence. She had known it since he was small. The particular quality of it, the way it was different from ordinary quiet, the way it contained something that was working its way toward the surface. Finally, he looked up. Mom. Yes. His jaw was tight. He was his father's son in the way he held things when he was working through them. Still on the outside, moving on the inside. People are saying you've lost your mind. Ingrid said nothing. Tommy Greer said his father said you're building a fire trap. He said his father said the whole place will be ash by January. He looked at the table, then back at her. And people at the store are saying, "What do you think?" she asked. He stopped. The question was not what he had expected. He had come in with something to say, and she had redirected it immediately, as she often did, and now he had to answer rather than continue with what he had prepared. Caleb looked at the table. I think. He stopped again. I don't know what I think. I just know that everyone is talking about it, and I have to go to school every day. He looked up. His voice was honest, not accusatory. Can't you just build a regular woodshed like everyone else? The table was quiet for a moment. Ruth, who had been sitting at the far end pretending to focus on her needlework, went very still. Ingrid looked at her son. He was Reuben's son in the way that mattered most. Honest, direct, not given to pretending things were fine when they weren't. She had always respected that about him. She respected it now, even though it was aimed at something she had spent 18 months thinking through and was not going to abandon because 12-year-old boys at a schoolyard had opinions about it. You remember February, she said. His face changed. The tight, prepared quality left it, replaced by something more open and less comfortable. Of course he remembered February. He had been the one with the fever. He had been the one she'd spent that whole terrible night trying to keep warm, burning through the woodpile in her panic. He had been half-conscious through most of it, moving in and out of the fever dream, but he remembered enough. He remembered his mother's voice, steady and quiet, talking to him through the worst of it. He remembered waking in the morning to find the fever broken and his mother sitting on the floor with her back against the stove, still awake after a night of feeding the fire, looking out the window at something he couldn't see from the bed. He had known even then that something had shifted in her in that moment. He had seen it without being able to name it. That can't happen again, Ingrid said. Not to you, not to Ruth. Caleb looked at the table again. His jaw was still set, but the set of it had changed. It was not the jaw of someone about to argue. It was the jaw of someone who understood something and was deciding whether to admit that he understood it. "People are laughing," he said. His voice was quieter now, more honest, less prepared. "I know. Doesn't that bother you?" She thought about that for a moment, a real moment, not the kind of pause that comes before a prepared answer. She actually considered the question, because it deserved consideration and because Caleb, despite being 12 years old and embarrassed, deserved a real answer. "What bothers me," she said finally, "is running out of wood in February. What other people think about how I stack it doesn't keep us warm." Caleb said nothing. She picked up her fork again, but she kept watching him. He sat with it. She could see him working through it, the embarrassment on one side, the logic on the other, and somewhere in the middle, the memory of that February night that neither of them talked about directly, but both of them carried. The way the cold had felt even through the fever. The way his mother had looked in the morning, standing at the door, looking at something he couldn't see from the bed. He didn't say anything else that night, but something had shifted. She could see it in the way he sat with the silence, not fighting it anymore, just holding it, the way you hold something when you're deciding what to do with it. August became September. The frame filled in layer by layer, cord by cord, the wooden walls rising higher every week as Ingrid and Caleb worked through the long autumn days. Caleb did not say anything more about stopping. He had not come to her and announced a change of mind. He was his father's son, and Reuben had never made announcements about things like that. He had simply started showing up after chores with his work gloves on, ready to help. And that was how the conversation ended and the building continued. Large logs formed the outer face of each wall. Smaller pieces filled the interior gaps, packed tightly enough to create a solid, dense structure, but with the natural irregularities of stacked timber that created thousands of small air pockets throughout. Those pockets mattered. Ingrid understood that from her father's explanations and from her own years of observing how structures held heat. Still air was insulation. Moving air was the enemy. The wood walls would stop the moving air and replace it with stillness, and stillness would do the rest. By the middle of September, the cabin had all but disappeared inside its wooden fortress. Only the roof and chimney remained clearly visible above the 8-foot walls, the chimney rising from the center of the structure like a thin finger pointing at the sky, with 4 feet of clear space around its base. The flat creek stones laid in a careful fire break that Ingrid had constructed before the walls reached that height. The covered entrance went up in the last week of September. A narrow corridor, 4 feet wide and 8 feet long, cut directly through the south wall of stacked timber with a simple wooden roof over it to keep the snow from accumulating in the passage. From the outside, it looked like a tunnel through a wall of timber. From the inside, it looked like the most protected entryway Ingrid had ever stood in. She walked through it one evening near the end of the month when the first real cold was beginning to settle into the valley, not the deep killing cold of December, but the preliminary cold of late autumn, the kind that came in from the northwest in the evenings and reminded you of what was coming. She stood in the middle of the corridor and felt the air around her. Outside, the evening wind was picking up from the north, the kind that came ahead of a weather change, cold and searching, probing at every surface it encountered, looking for anything it could pull heat from. Inside the corridor, the air was still, not merely quieter, still, not reduced but absent, as if the wind outside belonged to a different world entirely, a world that ended at the outer face of the timber wall and did not extend to where she stood. She placed her hand against the inner wall of the cabin, the original log wall of the structure Reuben had built in 1879. The wood was warmer than it should have been on an evening this cold. The thick outer walls had done their work through the afternoon. The air trapped between them and the cabin had held the warmth the autumn sun had deposited during the day and had not been stripped away by the evening wind because the evening wind could not reach it. She stood in that stillness for a long time. She thought about her father, about Gunnar moving quietly through the timber yards along the Norwegian River, watching things, noticing things, storing observations in the particular way he stored them, which was permanent and precise. She thought about the way he had answered her question when she was 9 years old, simply, without drama, trusting her to think about it. She thought about Reuben, who had listened to her talk about wind and wood and heat on a winter evening years ago. early in their Montana years, when the memory of the Norwegian timber yards had come up in conversation the way old memories do, unexpectedly, prompted by something in the present. He had listened without skepticism, the way he always listened to her. "That makes sense," he had said. "You should remember that." And then he had gone back to whatever he had been working on. She had remembered it. She thought about February. She thought about standing at the cabin door looking at the nearly empty woodpile. She thought about what she had felt in that moment and what that feeling had set in motion, and how long the distance was between that February morning and this September evening, standing in a wooden corridor that had not existed 4 months ago. Then she walked back inside and set a modest fire in the stove, a careful, unhurried fire, a fire that did not need to fight anything. And for the first time in 2 years, she did not lie awake worrying about whether she had enough wood to survive what was coming. The structure was finished. The cold was coming. And in Harlow Creek Valley, Montana territory, in the autumn of 1893, nobody, not Amos Buxton, not the men at the Cutler Creek General Store, not Ezra Whitmore sitting in his chair by the window, watching and waiting and reserving judgment, had any idea what they were about to learn. Winter was still on its way, and the woman inside the wooden fortress had already done the math. The first storm came on a Thursday. It arrived the way serious Montana storms always arrived. Not with drama, not with warning, but with a kind of quiet inevitability, the way a door closes in an empty house. The sky changed color first. The pale blue of the autumn afternoon deepened into something darker, something with weight behind it, as if the sky were slowly filling with something heavier than air. By evening, the clouds had come down low enough that the ridge behind the Sorensen homestead disappeared entirely, swallowed by the gray. By midnight, the wind had found its voice. Ingrid was awake when it started. She had not been sleeping deeply. She rarely did in the first weeks of winter, that old habit of vigilance that 2 hard Montana seasons had built into her without asking permission. She lay still and listened to the sound building outside the cabin walls. The wind rose slowly, the way a river rises after rain upstream, adding to itself continuously, becoming more than it had been the moment before, accumulating force with the patience of something that had all the time it needed. She waited for what came next. What came next was nothing. No rattling of the window frames, no thin whistle of cold air finding its way through the gaps in the logs. No sense of the temperature inside the cabin beginning its slow, familiar surrender to the temperature outside. The stove ticked quietly. The fire she had banked before sleep was doing exactly what a properly banked fire was supposed to do. Holding, patient, steady, not fighting anything, not being asked to fight anything. She sat up slowly. The cabin was warm. Not aggressively warm, not the desperate, almost feverish heat of a stove burning too fast, trying to outrun the cold pressing in from every side. Just warm, settled. The kind of warmth that belongs to a room rather than passes through it. Warmth that had taken up residence and intended to stay. She got up and walked to the south wall and opened the cabin door. The entrance corridor stretched before her in the darkness. That 8-foot tunnel through the timber. The air inside it perfectly still. She stepped into it and pulled the door closed behind her. Outside, at the far end of the passage, she could hear the storm in full voice. Wind driving snow sideways across the valley. The hard, flat sound of it moving fast and without mercy over open ground. She could hear it against the outer wall of stacked timber, a low, continuous pressure, like a large hand pressing steadily against something that was not going to move. Inside the corridor, the air was completely still. She walked slowly to the outer end of the entrance and looked out at the valley. The storm had no shape in the darkness, just movement and sound and cold, the whole world reduced to those 3 things. She stood at the threshold of the corridor and felt with precise clarity the difference between the air where she stood and the air 6 inches beyond her. On one side of that line, stillness, warmth held in place, air that had nowhere to go and nothing demanding it leave. On the other, the full force of a Montana November storm, indifferent and unrelenting. She stood there for a full minute, then she walked back inside, closed the cabin door, and returned to bed. She did not add wood to the fire. She did not need to. Caleb found out the next morning. He had woken in the night himself. Not from cold, which was what had always pulled him awake on winter nights before. The slow, creeping awareness at the edge of sleep that the temperature had dropped and the stove needed attention. He had woken from a dream, something shapeless that dissolved before he could catch it, and he had lain in his bunk listening to the storm with the particular alert stillness of someone trying to understand something. The storm was loud. He could hear it clearly. The wind working across the valley, the sound of it moving through the trees on the ridge above the property, the deep bass note of it pushing against the outer walls. He heard all of that. It was present and real and unmistakable. What he did not hear was what had always accompanied it before. The thin, persistent draft that came through the north wall and found the back of your neck no matter how you arranged the blankets. The shudder of the window frame on the west side of the cabin when the gusts reached a certain strength. The way the whole structure seemed to lean slightly and then settle again under the weight of serious wind, as if the cabin were considering its options and deciding each time to hold its ground. None of that. He got up quietly, careful not to wake Ruth in the bunk beneath his, and walked to the cabin door in his socks and opened it. He stepped into the entrance corridor and stopped. The storm was right there. He could hear it perfectly, just beyond the outer wall of timber, perhaps 20 feet from where he stood, the full force of a Montana November blizzard working itself against the stacked wood. He could hear the weight of it pressing. He could hear, or feel the distinction was not clear, the sound of snow packing into the gaps between the outer logs, filling them, making the whole structure incrementally denser with every hour that passed. He could not feel it. He stood there for a long time, longer than he needed to in order to confirm what he was experiencing. He stayed because the experience was one he wanted to hold on to. The strange stillness of standing inside something that was absorbing an enormous amount of force and converting it to silence. He was 12 years old, and he had grown up on a Montana homestead, and he understood cold and wind in the practical, physical way that children who grow up in hard climates understand them. And what he was standing in the middle of was something he had never felt before. In the morning at breakfast, he sat across from his mother and looked at her for a long moment before saying anything. She was eating without haste, the way she ate when she was not worried about anything. Steadily, focused, not distracted. The wind didn't get through, he said. No, Ingrid said. He thought about it. I stood in the corridor last night. I could hear it clearly, but I couldn't. She nodded. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. He looked at his hands around the coffee cup. The stove this morning, you didn't put much in. Half what I used last November, she said. He sat with that. Half. He knew what last November had been. My son, the first winter without his father, the wood consumption that had alarmed both of them, the constant calculations his mother had been running in her head from October to March. Half of that, he looked at his hands, said nothing for a while. Outside, the storm was still moving through the valley. They could hear it faintly through the timber walls. A distant sound, almost abstract, like weather happening in a different county. Something you could hear clearly if you listened for it, but that did not require your attention if you had other things to think about. The storm lasted 4 days. During those 4 days, Ingrid kept a careful count. She had not told anyone what she was observing. Not Caleb, not the neighbors when they passed on the road, not anyone. She was a precise woman by temperament, her father's daughter in that particular way, and she understood with the clarity of someone who has been wrong before about things she was sure of. The difference between noticing something once and knowing something with the confidence that comes from repeated, documented, verifiable evidence. One night of controlled burning proved nothing. One calm morning inside the corridor proved nothing. What she needed was a pattern, consistent, repeated, specific enough to be useful and definitive enough to be undeniable. She kept a small record in the back of her household accounts book. Each morning, the precise amount of wood she had used overnight, measured in the only unit available to her. The number and size of logs. Each evening, the condition of the fire before sleep. The temperature outside at regular intervals throughout the day, read from the thermometer she had hung on the outer frame of the entrance corridor, sheltered from direct wind by the roof above it, so that the reading reflected air temperature rather than wind chill. What the numbers showed was not subtle. She was burning less than half the wood she had burned during the first 4-day storm of the previous winter. Not slightly less, not marginally less. Less than half, consistently, across 4 days of sustained cold and wind, in conditions that were, if anything, more severe than what the valley had experienced the previous November. The temperature inside the cabin was steadier than it had ever been during winter. It did not rise and fall in the dramatic cycles that the stove tending had always produced before, did not require the constant vigilance that the previous 2 winters had demanded, did not drop in the hours before dawn to the level that pulled everyone awake from cold. It held. It simply held the way the temperature in a well-designed space holds when the walls around it are doing their job. The timber walls were doing exactly what she had calculated they would do. They blocked the wind. The snow packing into the outer gaps was making the whole structure tighter and more effective with every storm, not less. Each storm was improving the insulation rather than degrading it, which was the opposite of how ordinary structures responded to winter weather. She closed the accounts book and put it away in the drawer. She still said nothing to anyone. She wanted December. She wanted the real cold, the cold that separated the winters that merely tested you from the winters that genuinely tried to kill you. She wanted the kind of evidence that could not be argued with, and she was willing to wait for it. Amos Buxton noticed the chimney first. He had ridden past the Sorensen homestead twice since the first storm, not with any specific intention of checking on it, but because the eastern road was the better road in early winter. Less exposed to the prevailing wind, better drained from the summer rains, easier on horses when the ground was alternately frozen and thawed. Both times he had slowed his horse without consciously deciding to. The chimney bothered him. He was a man who noticed things about other people's properties the way any experienced rancher noticed things. Not intrusively, but with the background attentiveness that came from years of reading the landscape for information about conditions and weather and how other people were managing. And in weather like this, with temperatures in the low single digits and wind coming steady and hard from the northwest, a cabin chimney should look a specific way. He knew what that way looked like. He had one of his own. Thick smoke, dense and moving fast, pulled upward by the draw and torn sideways by the wind almost before it cleared the chimney cap. The visual evidence of a stove burning at or near capacity, fighting the cold in the particular exhausting way that iron stoves fight Montana cold when there is nothing standing between the fire and the full force of the season. The chimney above the Sorensen timber walls showed nothing like that. Light smoke, steady but thin. The kind of smoke that came from a fire that was burning at a relaxed, unhurried pace. A fire that was maintaining a temperature, not struggling to reach one. The kind of smoke you saw in October, before the real cold arrived. Not in December, not in this wind. He rode past the second time and slowed almost to a stop, staring at the chimney for long enough that his horse shifted impatiently beneath him, wanting to keep moving in the cold. It made no sense to him. It should not have been possible. In that weather, with temperatures like those and wind coming from that direction at that strength, a cabin that size should have been burning wood at a pace that produced a very different signature above the roofline. He rode on, but he could not stop thinking about it. The third time he came past the Sorensen homestead, he stopped. He dismounted at the edge of the property and walked toward the entrance corridor in the south wall. He told himself he was checking on the widow, which was a reasonable thing for a neighbor to do in the second week of a hard winter. He told himself that was the entire reason he had stopped. He stepped into the entrance corridor. The wind stopped. He stood very still. It was not that the wind became quieter or reduced itself to something more manageable. It stopped, completely, with the abruptness of a door closing. He could hear it still, just beyond the outer wall, working against the stacked timber, pressing against it with the relentless patience he had heard all morning as he rode the valley, but it did not reach him. He was standing 8 feet inside a wall of stacked wood, and the wind outside might as well have been in a different country. The air in the corridor was still, and he realized perceptibly warmer than the air outside. Not warm in an absolute sense, not the warmth of a heated room, but warmer than open-air Montana in December had any right to be. Warmer than he had any explanation for. Warmer in a way that his body registered immediately and his mind took several extra seconds to catch up with. He stood there for a moment longer than he had intended. Then he walked to the cabin door and knocked. Ingrid opened it. Warm air moved past her into the corridor. Not dramatically warm, not the overheated air of a stove burning at full force, but the steady, temperate warmth of a room that had been maintaining its temperature all day without effort. The interior was visible behind her. Ruth sat at the table with a book open in front of her. The stove burned at a moderate, unhurried pace. The whole scene had the quality of a household that was not currently experiencing a crisis. Amos removed his hat. "How much wood have you burned this week?" he asked. Ingrid looked at him for a moment. "Less than you," she said. He stood in the doorway, his jaw tightened slightly, working on something. "That's not possible," he said. "It's wind," she said. Her voice was even. "The walls stop the wind. The stove only has to heat the room, not fight the whole valley." He looked past her at the stove, back at her face. He was a man who trusted what he could verify with his own body and his own senses, and he had just stood in that corridor and felt the absence of wind with complete physical certainty. He could not argue with what his own body had registered, but he was also a man who had taken the story of the widow's construction to the Cutler Creek General Store in July and had stood at the counter and let the laughter run around the room and had said nothing to correct it. He had ridden away from this property in July shaking his head, and he had not done anything since to indicate that his head had changed position. He put his hat back on. "That corridor," he said, "the entrance tunnel." "Yes." He nodded once. Slowly, with a quality of deliberateness that suggested he was committing the nod to memory as much as making it for her benefit. Then he walked back out of the corridor without saying anything else, remounted his horse, and rode away toward Cutler Creek. He did not tell anyone at the general store what he had felt in that corridor. He told himself he needed to think about it more before drawing conclusions. He told himself it was a single observation, not a pattern. He was a man who trusted patterns over single observations, and one visit to one corridor in one storm was not a pattern. He told himself all of this on the ride into town, and by the time he reached the store and the conversation turned, as it always turned in December in that store, to firewood and weather and who was burning through their supply, at what rate, he said nothing about the Sorensen property except that the widow seemed to be managing adequately. But that night, after Margaret and the children were asleep, Amos Buxton went out to his barn. He worked for 2 hours in the dark, by lantern light, moving the extra cords he had cut in October and staged near the barn wall. He moved them to the north face of his cabin. Not 8 feet deep, not a complete enclosure, just a solid wall of stacked wood against the face of the structure that took the worst of the prevailing wind. He worked quietly. He had no interest in explaining himself. He told himself it was practical. He told himself he had always meant to store the extra cords closer to the cabin. He told himself a lot of things as he worked in the cold dark, his breath coming in small white clouds under the lantern light. He stacked the wood against the north wall of his cabin and went back to bed and said nothing about it to anyone in the morning, or the morning after that. December arrived and changed the character of everything. The easy part of winter, the part where you were still drawing from the top of your reserves, still a comfortable distance from the real worry, was over. The cold had been building since the first November storm, each wave slightly colder and more sustained than the last. And what December brought was not a new weather system arriving from outside, but the completion of one that had been assembling itself for weeks. The temperature dropped overnight from 12 above to 22 below and did not come back up. At 22 below, the valley simplified itself. Survival was not a figure of speech anymore. It was a daily calculation performed automatically, constantly, by everyone. Wood, heat, water, livestock. The order of those priorities shifted depending on the hour and the temperature and what had happened most recently. But they were always the 4 things, and they were always all 4 of them, and the margin between managing them and being overwhelmed by them had narrowed to something that required full attention. Men who had been careful with their reserves discovered that careful was not the same as sufficient. The wood piles they had looked at in October with satisfaction were speaking a different language now, and the language they were speaking was not encouraging. At the Cutler Creek store, the conversations that had been concerned in November became something tighter in December. Men stood at the counter and talked in the specific, practical vocabulary of real scarcity. How many cords remained? How many weeks of serious cold were left in the season? Whether the timber camp at the river junction to the north still had cut wood available, and what premium they were charging for winter delivery. Someone mentioned the Sorensen property. Someone always did, eventually. She's still living inside that timber pile. Rode past 2 days ago. Chimney barely making smoke. The room was quieter about it than it had been in November. The laughter still came, but it had changed character. Shorter now, less certain, with an edge in it that had not been there before. The men who laughed were the ones who had not yet faced the specific mathematics of their own wood supplies, or who had faced them and found a way to not believe the answer. Ezra Whitmore sat in his chair near the window and listened to all of it. He had visited the Sorensen homestead once since the November storm. A brief visit, the kind he made when he wanted to observe something without making the observation into an event. He had walked through the entrance corridor. He had stood in it for a moment and felt what there was to feel. He had stepped into the cabin and noted the temperature, the pace of the fire, the general condition of a household in the middle of what was becoming a very hard winter. On his way out, he had stopped at the door and turned back. "I saw something like this once," he said. "Long time ago. In Europe. A man who built the same way." Ingrid waited. "It worked," Ezra said. Then he walked back through the corridor, mounted his horse, and rode home. That was the entirety of his contribution to the matter. It was, in the way of Ezra Whitmore, exactly enough. The blizzard came on the 14th of December. It came the way the worst storms come. Not as an escalation of what had already been happening, but as something categorically different, a different order of event. The sky darkened by noon. The wind rose with a speed that was itself alarming. By mid-afternoon, visibility across the valley floor had dropped to almost nothing. The snow coming sideways in dense, continuous sheets that erased the middle distance entirely, that made the familiar landscape of the valley into something strange and unnavigable. By nightfall, it was a full blizzard, the kind that people talked about for years afterward. The kind that became a reference point. The winter of '93, they would say, meaning the 14th of December and what followed it. The temperature fell through the night in the particular way that blizzard temperatures fall. Not in a steady descent, but in drops, each one lower than the last, as if something were testing the lower limits of what the valley could sustain. 20 below, 25, 30. By midnight, the thermometer on the outer frame of Ingrid's entrance corridor read 38 below zero. Inside the cabin, the stove burned at the pace Ingrid had set before going to sleep. She had placed 2 logs in it, and gone to bed. She woke at 2 in the morning. Not from cold, not from the sound of wind finding its way through a gap in the logs or the shudder of a window frame under pressure. She woke because the storm outside had reached a volume that penetrated even 8 feet of stacked timber. Not as wind, not as cold, but as sound. A deep, sustained bass register roar, the voice of something very large moving very fast over open ground, and the sheer scale of it reached into the cabin and touched the edge of her sleep and pulled her awake. She lay still for a moment listening. The cabin was warm. She got up and opened the cabin door and stepped into the corridor. The sound intensified immediately. The full voice of the blizzard working against the outer walls, a sound that was not like ordinary wind, but something deeper and more continuous. The sound of enormous force being absorbed by something built to absorb it. She could feel the vibration of it faintly, transmitted through the packed timber, arriving at her feet and her fingertips as something so attenuated it was barely perceptible. 8 feet of stacked wood, each layer absorbing a fraction of the energy, until what reached the inner wall of the corridor was almost nothing. She walked to the outer end of the corridor and looked out. She could see nothing. The blizzard had taken the valley completely. No moonlight, no shapes in the darkness, no sense of distance or direction. Just the white movement of driven snow and the sound of the storm, and a cold so complete that it had a physical weight to it, a pressure you felt not just on the skin but somewhere deeper. She stood at the threshold for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back to the inner wall of the corridor, the log wall of the cabin itself, and placed her hand flat against the wood. The wall was warm, not the warmth of something close to a fire. The warmth of something that had been protected all night, that had not been required to surrender its heat to anything, that had been left alone to hold what it had. The warmth of a wall that was doing exactly what a wall is supposed to do in conditions specifically designed to prevent it from doing so, and succeeding. She stood with her hand against the warm wood of her cabin wall, while the worst blizzard of the decade roared against the outer timber on the other side of 8 feet of stacked cordwood, and she felt something move through her that she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. Not triumph, that was not the right word, and she would not have chosen it. Not vindication, though that was closer. It was something quieter and more personal than either of those public-facing feelings. It was the feeling of having followed something all the way to its end, of having asked a question and refused to stop before reaching the answer, of having carried a thing her father had told her when she was 9 years old across an ocean, and a continent, in 2 hard winters, in one devastating February morning, and of having trusted it enough to build it, and of standing now in the proof of it. Her father had watched timber yards in Norway and noticed something true. She had remembered it. She had not let anyone laugh it out of her. She stood there a while longer than she needed to. Then she went back inside and got into bed and slept the rest of the night without waking once. The blizzard lasted 3 days. On the morning after the second day, while the storm was still running at full strength, a sound came from outside that Ingrid had not expected. It came not from the storm itself, but through it, the sound of movement in the entrance corridor. Someone was there. She opened the cabin door and looked down the passage. A figure stood at the far end, snow-covered and bent slightly against the wind at the corridor's outer opening, barely visible against the white. She walked down the corridor. The figure resolved into a woman, Eleanor Marsh, from the property 2 miles to the south. Her coat was inadequate for the temperature. Her face showed the controlled, careful expression of someone who has made a decision that cost them something significant and is determined not to let the cost show more than necessary. "My stove went cold," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. "We burned through the last of the main stack last night." She paused. "My children are with me, and my mother." "How many?" Ingrid said. "3 children, and my mother makes 5 of us." Ingrid stepped back from the entrance without hesitation. "Come through," she said. Eleanor Marsh came through, and behind her, out of the storm, came her 3 children and her elderly mother, all of them moving with the particular careful deliberateness of people who have been cold for longer than is comfortable and are managing the fact of it with whatever dignity they can maintain. Ingrid brought them inside and put more wood on the fire. She checked her wood supply with a practiced eye. Even with additional bodies in the cabin, even with the stove running warmer to account for the extra people, she had enough. Far more than enough. The timber walls had been doing their work since October. The stove had not been fighting the full force of the season for 2 months. Her reserves were, by the standards of every previous winter she had spent in this valley, remarkably intact. She put a pot of water on for coffee. She did not say anything about wood supplies or calculations or what she had predicted and what had come true. There was nothing useful to say about any of that at this particular moment. There were cold people in her cabin, and she had heat, and she had room, and she had coffee, and those were the only relevant facts. But the storm was not finished, and before it ended, more people would be coming through the corridor. The second family arrived 2 hours after Eleanor Marsh. Ingrid heard them before she saw them. The sound of boots in the entrance corridor, heavier and more urgent than Eleanor's careful steps had been. She opened the cabin door before they reached it. Wendell Pratt stood at the threshold with his wife Clara and their 2 sons behind him. Wendell was a large man, a farmer 8 years in the valley, a man whose physical size had always given him a certain natural confidence about his ability to manage what the land presented. He had told Clara in October that they had enough wood. He had calculated it himself, and he had been certain about it in the specific way that certain men are certain about things. Not because the calculation had been particularly careful, but because he could not easily imagine being wrong about something he had decided. He was not a man who came to other people's doors easily. He stood in the corridor entrance and looked at Ingrid without saying anything for a moment. The storm moved behind him, visible past his shoulder, a wall of white noise and driven snow. "We're short," he said. His voice was flat, stripped of everything except the information. He was not asking for sympathy. He was stating a condition that required addressing. "Come in," Ingrid said. He brought his family through. Ruth moved to the corner near the window without being asked, creating space. Caleb pulled the extra blankets from the storage chest at the foot of his bunk and handed them to Clara Pratt without ceremony. Just handed them across and turned back to what he had been doing, the way his mother handled things that needed doing. Now there were 12 people in a cabin built for three. The room changed with the bodies in it, tighter, warmer from the additional heat that 12 people generated collectively, the air thicker and more inhabited. Ingrid ran the calculation automatically. Additional bodies meant additional heat production. The stove, paradoxically, would not need to work harder. The timber walls had been maintaining the cabin temperature for 2 months with considerable efficiency, and that would continue regardless of how many people were inside producing warmth of their own. She had the wood, she had the warmth, she had the space, managed carefully. What she did not have yet was Amos Buxton. He arrived at 4 in the morning. The blizzard had found something beyond its earlier intensity in the late-night hours, the temperature dropping again below what it had been at midnight, the wind shifting slightly and finding a new angle against the outer walls, the storm revealing that it had not yet shown everything it intended to show. The valley outside was something that experienced Montana settlers found genuinely alarming. Not merely serious, alarming. Ingrid was not asleep. With 12 people in the cabin, she had moved to the chair near the stove, giving her bunk to the Pratt boys. And she sat in the firelight, keeping the fire at its steady pace and listening to the storm and thinking about nothing in particular. The knock came at the outer entrance of the corridor. She walked down the tunnel and found Amos Buxton standing in the opening with snow covering his coat from the collar to his boots. He was not alone. Margaret stood just behind him, and behind Margaret, their youngest daughter, pressed against her mother's side. Margaret's face told the story before Amos said anything. There was a particular quality to severe cold exposure, a grayish undertone to the skin, a stillness in the body that was not calm but careful. The careful stillness of a system conserving what it had left. Margaret had it. She had been cold for too long. She needs to come in now, Ingrid said. She was already moving, taking Margaret's arm, guiding her toward the cabin with the efficient directness of someone who knows what needs to happen and is not going to let anything slow it down. Amos followed without speaking. He said nothing as he came through the corridor. He said nothing as he stepped into the cabin, and the warmth received him. Not the frantic, compensatory warmth of a stove burning itself up, trying to hold back something that could not be held back, but the steady, even warmth of a room that had been maintaining its temperature all night, without drama, without crisis, without running out of the resources required to do so. He looked at the 12 people already inside. Eleanor Marsh near the stove with her children arranged around her. Wendell Pratt standing against the far wall with the particular posture of a large man in a small space, careful not to take more room than necessary. The children distributed on the bunks and the floor in the creative arrangements that children find naturally when adult spatial reasoning has run out of options. He sat Margaret down near the stove without being directed to. Ingrid brought a blanket, then coffee, then a second blanket. Margaret's hands, wrapped around the tin cup, began to loosen their stiffness by degrees. Color moved back into her face slowly, the way color comes back when cold has taken it. Not all at once, but incrementally, the body negotiating with itself about what it could afford to restore and in what order. Their daughter pressed against her mother's side. Ingrid brought the girl a cup of warm water with sugar dissolved in it, and the girl drank it without speaking, holding the cup with both hands. Amos stood near the wall and watched all of this. The stove burned steadily. The room held its warmth. 15 people in a cabin built for three in the middle of the worst blizzard in recent memory, at 38 below zero outside, and the room held its warmth. Outside, the blizzard drove itself against the timber walls with everything it had. Inside, it was quiet. The storm broke near dawn on the third day. It did not end cleanly. Montana storms almost never did. It reached the limit of what it had to give, and then simply stopped giving it. The wind dropping in the course of a few hours from its sustained roar to something intermittent, and then to something occasional, and then to the ordinary silence of a winter morning after weather. The snow shifted from horizontal to nearly vertical, and then slowed to scattered flurries, and then stopped. The sky above the cloud cover began to remember that it contained a sun. By mid-morning, pale light lay across the valley. People began to move. The Pratt boys, who had slept on Caleb's bunk in a configuration that suggested physics were merely a suggestion, woke up and looked out the window at a world that had been substantially rearranged. Eleanor Marsh's mother asked quietly if there was any more coffee and received a cup with both hands and held it with a look of simple, uncomplicated gratitude that required nothing added to it. Ingrid opened the cabin door and walked down the entrance corridor and stepped out into the still morning air. The valley had been remade. Every fence line had vanished under drifted snow. The road to Cutler Creek was a smooth white surface with no evidence that it had ever been a road. The ridge behind the homestead wore a new cornice of snow along its edge, brilliant in the thin winter light. The world was very white and very quiet and very cold, and there was a quality to the stillness after a 3-day blizzard that had a particular character. The silence of something that has said everything it intended to say and is now waiting to see what the response will be. The outer walls of the timber fortress were nearly invisible. Snow had packed against them in the storm and drifted over their top edges until the whole structure looked less like something built and more like something geological. A long rectangular ridge rising from the valley floor, with only the chimney and the uppermost edge of the roof visible above it. The walls had become part of the landscape. Inside the entrance corridor, not a single flake of snow had found its way in. Ingrid stood outside the tunnel entrance and looked out at the valley with the unhurried attention of someone who has time to look, which was itself something new. Footsteps behind her, Amos Buxton came down the corridor and stopped beside her at the entrance. He looked out at the valley for a longer time without speaking. She let him look. She understood that he was doing something more than observing the landscape. He was processing, the way he had always processed things, privately and at his own pace, working through something that required working through before he could say anything useful about it. She waited. The valley lay silent and white before them. Somewhere to the west, a crow called once and did not call again. He finally spoke. "How did you know?" he asked. His voice had none of the defensive qualities she might have expected, none of the residual resistance of someone who had been wrong about something and was framing a question as a way of recovering ground. It was a plain question, asked plainly. He had decided that understanding mattered more than how he appeared while seeking it, and he had made that decision somewhere in the previous 3 days, and now he was asking. Ingrid looked out at the valley. "My father worked timber yards in Norway," she said. 30 years he worked those yards." She paused. He watched which families used the least wood to stay the warmest, the ones nearest the log stacks. He watched it for years before he told me about it. She looked out at the white valley. He watched the world quietly for a long time before he said anything about what he saw. "I got that from him." Amos was quiet. He watched the timber yards, she continued, and he noticed the way the stacked wood held what little sun there was through the winter and released it at night, and the way it stopped the wind. She paused again. "He told me once, cold travels on wind. Stop the wind and you stop half the winter." Amos stood with that. He had heard something like it before. She had said something in July when he had come to look at the frame, something about wind and heat. And he had heard the words but not really listened to them because he had already made up his mind about what he was looking at. He had heard it again in December when he had come to ask about the chimney smoke, and she had told him at the cabin door, and he had heard that too without really receiving it because he was still at that point carrying the resistance of a man who had staked out a position in July and was not yet ready to release it. He heard it differently now. "You knew it would work," he said, "before you started." "I believed it would work," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her. "I grew up watching it work," she said. "I thought about it for a year before I built it. I kept records all through November and December. Wood used, temperature held, hours between stokings." She looked down at her hands and then back at the valley. "But believing something and knowing it are not the same thing until the thing is tested. I believed it. Now I know it." Amos nodded slowly. That was language he understood entirely. The language of a person who trusted the difference between hypothesis and evidence, who knew that conviction, however well-founded, was not the same as proof. It was, in fact, precisely how he thought about things himself. He had simply, in July, failed to extend the same standard to her that he extended to people who looked more like the people he was accustomed to learning from. He was aware of that failure now. He was standing in the awareness of it, in the cold morning air outside a wooden fortress that had sheltered 15 people through the worst storm in a decade, and he was not looking away from what that awareness required him to acknowledge. He said nothing more. He stood there another minute, looking out at the valley with its 9 invisible fence lines and its buried road and its chimney stubs visible above the drifted white. Then he turned and walked back inside. The families left through the morning as the snow settled and the roads became passable, in the specific way Montana roads became passable after serious storms. Not clear, not safe exactly, but navigable by people who knew the difference between navigable and safe and trusted their own judgment about which was which. Eleanor Marsh left first. Her children and her mother moved in a line through the drifted snow toward the road south. At the entrance to the corridor, Eleanor paused and turned back. "Thank you," she said, simply, without additional words, which was the right way to say it. Ingrid nodded. The Pratt family left an hour later. Wendell shook Ingrid's hand at the corridor entrance. A firm handshake, brief, the kind that contained more than any length of words could have conveyed. Amos and Margaret left last. Margaret had recovered fully by morning. Color returned, hands working normally, the gray quality entirely gone from her face. She embraced Ingrid at the corridor entrance without speaking. The embrace said what it needed to say. Amos waited until Margaret had passed through the tunnel. Then he turned back one more time. He looked at Ingrid for a moment. Something was working in his expression. Not discomfort exactly, but the look of a man who has decided to say something he would prefer not to have to say, and is going to say it anyway because that is the kind of man he has decided to be. "That north wall stack I put up in December," he said. Ingrid said nothing. He held her gaze. "It helped, not enough. But it helped," he said. She nodded once. She had known about it. The ridge road gave a clear view of his property on clear days, and she had noticed the change in his wood stack profile in early December. She had said nothing about it to anyone and had not intended to. He turned and walked through the corridor. She watched him go. That afternoon, after the last of the families had disappeared down the snow-covered road and the valley had returned to the particular quiet that follows a large event, Ingrid walked back through the entrance corridor alone. She stopped in the middle of it, the way she had stopped on the first September evening when the walls were newly finished and the winter had not yet said what it intended to say. She stood there and let herself be still for a moment without an immediate task waiting. She thought about her father, about Gunnar moving quietly through the timber yards in the pale winter light of Norway, watching things for 30 years before she had ever thought to ask him what he noticed. About the way he had answered without ceremony, trusting her to do something with it. About the way the right information, given at the right time to the right person, could travel across an ocean and a continent in 2 decades and still arrive intact. She thought about Reuben, about a winter evening years ago, when she had told him about the timber yards and the warm cabins and her father's explanation, and he had listened the way he always listened, fully, without hurry, without the slight impatience that most people brought to other people's observations about things that were not immediately relevant to them. "That makes sense," he had said. "You should remember that." She had remembered it. She put her hand against the outer wall of the cabin. The wall was still warm through 3 days of the worst cold the valley had recorded, protected from the demand that the blizzard had placed on every other structure in the valley. It had simply held what it had been given and refused to give it up. She stood there for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just standing in what she had built, feeling it hold. Then she went inside and put the kettle on. The rest of December settled into the long, steady cold that followed the blizzard. Less dramatic than what had preceded it, but in its own way more demanding. The cold that did not peak and pass but simply persisted, day after day, at temperatures that left no margin for carelessness. January and February would be like this. The valley knew it. Ingrid burned her wood at the same measured pace she had maintained since October. She had begun the season with more timber than she had ever cut. She was burning it at a fraction of her previous rate. What remained in the walls and in the barn was, by her careful calculation, sufficient to last well past March, past the end of the season entirely, with enough surplus to begin the following season ahead rather than behind. Caleb understood all of this now. He had understood the physical reality of it since the night he stood in the corridor during the first November storm and felt the stillness around him. But understanding a thing in your body and being able to articulate what it means were different things. And it was not until the morning after the blizzard, watching his mother move through a cabin full of neighbors with the same calm, practical efficiency she brought to everything, managing 15 people with the same ease she managed 3, that he found the words for what he had been working toward since August. He was doing the afternoon barn chores when Ingrid came in to check on the livestock. He kept his hands moving as he talked. It was the way he handled important conversations. Movement kept the awkwardness from collecting in his voice. Mom. Yes. He set down the fork. I'm sorry about what I said in August. About stopping. She looked at him. I know why I said it, he continued. I'm not saying I was wrong to feel it, but I was thinking about the wrong thing. She waited. I was thinking about what people would say. He paused. You were thinking about February. She held his gaze without speaking. I was thinking about the right thing, he said. You were thinking about the important thing. He picked up the fork again. Those aren't always the same. She stood in the barn in the quiet that followed that sentence, looking at her son. He was 12 years old. He was his father's son. He had needed a winter to teach him something that his father had known instinctively, without requiring the lesson. But he had needed it, and he had received it, and he had understood it, and that was what mattered. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder. Then she went back to checking on the livestock. Spring came to Harlow Creek Valley in the reluctant, incremental way it always came to high Montana country, the cold releasing its hold in stages rather than all at once, as if winter were unwilling to concede anything without being forced to concede it specifically. In March, the days lengthened and the angle of the sun changed, and the south-facing slopes began to show narrow lines of bare ground at their edges, brown and tentative. In April, the creek ran high with snowmelt, cold and fast and reliable as it had always been. In May, Ingrid began taking down the timber walls. This was the part she had never explained to anyone because explaining it would have required explaining everything else first, and the conversation had never seemed worth having. The wood in the walls was the same wood that would heat the cabin through the following winter. It had served as insulation through the cold season. It would dry further through the summer months, ready for burning when October arrived and the season began again. Nothing would be wasted. The system was complete, and it fed itself. Caleb helped her transfer the reclaimed wood to the barn, stacking it by size and length with the organization he had learned from her and she had learned from her father. Ruth carried the smaller pieces, working beside them without being asked, keeping pace. By the end of May, the cabin stood alone again. Just the structure itself, the original log walls and the roof and the chimney, sitting on its piece of Montana ground the way it had sat since Reuben built it in the year they arrived. No timber fortress surrounding it, just the cabin and the long summer ahead. Ingrid stood and looked at it. Ruth came and stood beside her, slipping her hand into her mother's in the easy, unself-conscious way of a child who has not yet learned to manage the expression of simple things. It looks smaller, Ruth said. Yes, Ingrid said. Are you going to build it again? In August, Ingrid said. Yes. Ruth looked up at her. Can I help this time? Actually help? You helped last time, Ingrid said. You carried branches. Ruth considered this with the serious expression she brought to matters of procedure. I want to carry logs this time, real ones. Ingrid looked down at her daughter for a moment. Then you'll carry logs, she said. Amos Buxton came to the homestead on a Thursday in June. Ingrid was in the kitchen garden when she saw him riding up the road, and she straightened and watched him come. He was riding with purpose, not with the casual, unhurried gait of someone passing through or dropping in without a specific reason, but with the deliberate pace of a man who had decided to do something and was doing it before he thought of a reason not to. He dismounted at the gate and walked to where she was standing. I want to understand it properly, he said, without preliminary. All of it. The frame dimensions, the post depth, the stacking pattern, the entrance corridor design, the chimney clearance. He paused. All of it. She looked at him. For yourself, she said. For myself, he said. And he stopped. And, she said. He looked at the ground for a moment, then back at her. There are 11 families in this valley who went through last December short on wood. He said it without drama, without accusation, simply as a fact requiring acknowledgement. Most of them have never seen what you built or understand how it works. Some of them will try to build something like it on their own and get the chimney clearance wrong or the stacking pattern wrong and create exactly the fire risk I warned you about in July. He held her gaze steadily. I know how to explain practical things to people in this valley in a way they'll engage with. He let that sit. If I understood the method correctly, I thought I might be useful. Ingrid studied him. She had known since the morning after the blizzard when he had stood beside her at the corridor entrance and asked how she had known that this conversation was coming. She had not known exactly when or in what form, but she had known that Amos Buxton, being who he was, would find his way to this. He was not asking for credit. He was not trying to position himself between the idea and its originator, to absorb it into his own story in a way that changed the attribution. He was asking, with a directness that was his most reliable quality and the humility that the winter had added to it, whether he could carry something forward, whether he could be useful to something larger than his own immediate interest. She picked up her trowel and finished the row she had been working on. Then she set it down and stood. "Come back Saturday," she said. "Bring paper. I'll show you everything." He nodded. He turned to go. Then he stopped. "Mrs. Sorensen." She waited. "In July," he said, "at the Cutler Creek store." He said it clearly and directly without softening it or managing it. "I told people you had lost your mind." He paused. It was not a fair thing to say. It was not a true thing to say. "I said it anyway." She looked at him for a moment. "You were also the first one to put wood against your north wall," she said. He was quiet. "You did it in the dark," she said, "in December, before you were ready to say anything out loud." She held his gaze. "That tells me more about you than what you said in July." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, got back on his horse, and rode away down the road without looking back. He came back on Saturday. He brought paper, and he brought, without advance explanation, two other men from the valley. Douglas Sewell, a farmer who had burned through nearly his entire winter's supply by February. Clarence Holt, a younger rancher who had spent 3 days of the December blizzard in his cabin, feeding the stove every 2 hours and watching his woodpile diminish at a rate that had frightened him. Both of them had heard what had happened at the Sorensen homestead during the blizzard. In the weeks since, it had become the kind of story a valley tells itself about itself. The story that gets told at the store counter and at the dinner table and at the church door after Sunday services, with different details depending on who was telling it and what they wanted it to mean. Both of them had come to hear it from the source. Ingrid showed them everything. She showed them the frame construction, the post depth that gave stability through the freeze-thaw cycles of Montana ground, the beam spacing, the precise distance from the cabin wall that created the optimal protected air corridor. She showed them the stacking pattern, large logs on the outer face for structural density, smaller pieces filling the interior gaps in an arrangement that maximized the air pockets responsible for thermal retention while maintaining the solidity of the wall. She showed them the chimney clearance, the full 4 feet on every side, the flat creek stones at the base, the design that converted the fire risk into a non-issue if the specifications were followed correctly. She showed them the accounts book. Douglas Sewell took the book and looked at the numbers for a long time. He was a precise man with numbers. He had come to farming through a background in commerce, and he trusted columns of figures the way Ingrid trusted thermometers. "That's half," he said finally, looking up. "Less than half some nights." "Yes," Ingrid said. He looked at the numbers again. His expression was the specific expression of a man who is revising an estimate. Not shocked, not embarrassed, just adjusting. "That is a very significant difference," he said. "Yes," Ingrid said. Clarence Holt had been quiet through most of the conversation, watching and listening in the way of someone who is aware of being the youngest person in a room and is trying to learn more than he talks. Near the end, he asked one question. "Why didn't anyone think of this before?" Amos looked at him, then he looked at Ingrid. Ingrid thought about the question carefully. It deserved a careful answer. "People did think of it," she said. "My father observed it." She paused. "People have known for a long time that wood holds heat and blocks wind. This isn't a new principle." She looked at the 3 men around her kitchen table. "The question is whether you trust what you've observed enough to follow it all the way to its conclusion, without stopping because someone laughs, without stopping because you can't explain every detail of why it should work before you've built it." She paused. Most people stop before the end. Something between the idea and the completion convinces them to stop. She looked at the accounts book on the table between them. "I had a reason not to stop," she said. No one asked her to name the reason. They all knew what February looked like. They had all spent enough winters in this valley to know exactly what she meant. That summer, 4 properties in Harlow Creek Valley began building timber walls around their cabins. Then 6, then 9. By August, the construction had acquired the character that useful ideas acquire when people stop debating them and start testing them. When the question shifts from whether the principle is sound to how to implement it correctly. Men who had been in the Cutler Creek store in July of 1893, laughing at a widow's strange project, were in July of 1894 measuring post spacing against notes they had taken at Ingrid Sorensen's kitchen table. Women who had heard the story in passing were sending their husbands to talk to Amos Buxton, who had become, through a combination of practical knowledge and personal motivation, the Valley's most effective teacher of a method that was not his. He taught it consistently, accurately, and without embellishment. He gave credit the same way every time, plainly, without hedging, without the qualifications that people sometimes add when they want to acknowledge something without fully acknowledging it. "Learn it from Mrs. Sorensen," he said, to every person who asked him. "She worked it out. I just listened." Ezra Whitmore, who had watched all of it from his characteristic distance, appeared one afternoon in late July at the edge of the Sorensen property, standing near the new frame going up for the second season's walls. He stood there for a while without speaking. Then he walked over to where Ingrid was working. "The Valley is learning," he said. "Slowly," Ingrid said. Ezra made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Everything worthwhile is learned slowly," he said. "That's what makes it stick." He walked back to his horse and then paused and turned back once more. "There's a young couple from Minnesota," he said, "arrived last month, building their first homestead on the north end of the valley." He looked at Ingrid. "I told them to come and talk to you before they built anything else." He paused. "They'll be here Tuesday." He mounted his horse and rode home without waiting for a response. The winter of 1894 arrived in the way winters arrived in Harlow Creek Valley, with cold and wind and the indifference of a climate that did not adjust itself to human needs or preparations. But the valley was different. 9 cabins sat inside timber walls by the time the first storm arrived in November. Their chimneys showed the same thin, steady signature that had puzzled travelers who passed the Sorensen homestead the previous year, the signature of fires burning at a sustainable pace because the wind had been removed from the equation. Wood supplies held longer. Stoves burned at rates that their owners could manage without anxiety. The calculation that every family in the valley ran continuously from November to March, days remaining against wood remaining, came out in better places than it had the year before or the year before that. The valley did not become easy. Montana winters did not become easy. The cold was the same cold. The wind was the same wind. The length of the season was the same length. None of that changed. But the valley had changed. It had learned something through one hard winter, one strange project, one woman who had refused to stop. And that learning had spread. The way learning spreads when someone has done the hard work of converting an observation into a proof and then made the proof available to anyone who wanted it. On a clear December evening of that winter, Ingrid stood on the low ridge behind the homestead and looked out over the valley. Below her, the lights of 9 cabins showed through the early darkness, small, warm, steady points in a large, cold landscape. Above each set of lights, a chimney. Above each chimney, that characteristic thin signature of a fire that was not in a hurry, not fighting anything, not burning itself up, trying to compensate for what the wind demanded. Caleb came up the ridge and stood beside her. They stood together in the cold without speaking for a while, looking at the same thing. "There are going to be fewer bad winters now," he said, "for everyone." She looked at him. "There will still be bad winters," she said. "Montana doesn't change." He nodded. "But we'll know how to face them better." She looked back out at the valley. "Your grandfather noticed something true," she said. "I remembered it. You built the walls beside me." She paused. "Someday you'll tell someone else." He was quiet for a moment. "I already have," he said. She looked at him. "Tommy Greer," he said. "His family is one of the ones who built this summer. He came and asked me how we did the stacking pattern." His voice was even. He apologized too, for what he said at school. Ingrid looked at her son. He was 12 years old, standing on a ridge in Montana in December, and he already understood something that the valley was still in the process of learning. That knowledge was not valuable because it made you warmer than other people, but because it could make other people warmer too. That the purpose of having figured something out was not to have figured it out. It was to pass it on. Reuben would have known that without needing a winter to teach it to him. But Caleb had needed the winter. He had gone into it not knowing, and he had come through it knowing. That was what winters were for. That was, in the end, what all of it had been for. The lights below them burned steadily in the cold Montana evening. 9 small warmths in the darkness of the valley, each one a different family, a different set of calculations now coming out in better places. All of them connected by a simple thing, the knowledge that wood holds the sun and cold travels on wind. And if you stop the wind, you stop half the winter. Ingrid looked at those lights for a long time. Then she turned and walked back down the ridge toward her cabin and went inside and set a modest fire in the stove, and the night did not touch her.